Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is supporting housing and mobility with resilient power in Boulder. We have a bunch of excellent guest speakers with us today who are going to be talking about our featured projects in Boulder, Colorado. And I'll be passing this over to them soon. We also have on the line with us our host for this webinar, Seth Mullendor. Seth is a project director and vice president for Clean Energy Group. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power project. Seth will be talking about all of that in just a moment. But first, before I send it over to him, I'd like to go over some quick housekeeping notes. Everyone on the line today is in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in using your telephone. If you would like to minimize this webinar console, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see here. And that arrow also works to expand it. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. To make sure that we get to your question, don't wait until the end to submit it. Type it in when you think of it. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the webinar recording within about 48 hours, probably this afternoon. And we'll also post it on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. That's also where you can go to find info about our upcoming webinars. So with that out of the way, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Seth Mullendor.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's going to be a great webinar. We have a bunch of great speakers, as Sam mentioned. So a little bit of background about us. Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit organization. We've been around for 20 years now, supported by a number of foundations, which you can see here on this slide. We also have a sister organization called Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a membership organization of entities that manage state clean energy funds. So as Sam mentioned, this is brought to you by our Resilient Power Project, which is a joint project with the Meridian Institute. The goal of the Resilient Power Project is really to increase access to what we call resilient power systems, which are essentially solar and storage, sometimes combined with other technology, specifically for disadvantaged communities, low income and otherwise vulnerable communities. We focus on a couple of areas on this, or several different areas. We do this at a policy level, where we try to get the right policies in place, also work on financial structures to increase access, and then work more on a community level, working on actually getting projects implemented, analyzed, and built. We've done a number of reports and analysis around resilient power, solar and storage for different types of facilities and the technologies themselves. You can see some coverage of those down here. That's all available on our website, resilient-power.org. So as part of our project, we work with a number of different projects across the country. So far, we've worked with over 100 projects on various levels, providing assistance, either technical assistance or sometimes small grants to help projects get going. You'll see a blue dot on Colorado. Those are the projects we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I'll lead in and start introducing our speakers for today that will talk to you about projects in Boulder, Colorado. I should mention that a large portion of these projects was supported by a grant from the Department of Energy as well, and you'll hear more about that as the speakers dig into the project. So first off, we're going to have Lex Teleshak. He's an electrical engineer with the City of Boulder, and he has managed the implementation of these projects in Boulder for the city. Then we're going to hear from Tim Bill, who is the Director of Sustainable Communities for Boulder Housing Partners, where he works to implement the organization's sustainability and resiliency goals. Boulder Housing Partners is the primary provider of affordable housing in the City of Boulder, and Tim acted as the project manager for Boulder Housing on this project. After that, we're going to hear from Tony Boniface, who's the owner and president of Independent Power Systems, which is a renewable energy design and installation company that he founded in 1996. IPS has installed well over 1,000 grid-tied solar systems, hundreds of off-grid solar and wind systems, dozens of grid-tied wind systems, and solar and battery storage backups. And they did the technical side of the Boulder Housing Partners project. Next, we're going to switch gears and talk about VIA Mobility Services. We're going to hear from Bill Patterson, who's the CFO of VIA Mobility, which is based in Boulder, Colorado. And VIA's mission is to promote self-sufficiency and independence for people with mobility limitations. They provide transportation options to people in the 7-county Denver, Colorado region and beyond. Bill acted as the project manager for VIA on this project, this resilient project. Then finally, we're going to hear from Ben Gregory, who is the Director of Business Development for POSN, which is an energy infrastructure development company specializing in DC microgrids. Ben played a key role in developing the technical solutions for POSN's work to date and is transitioning his technical team into the DC fast charging market. Ben worked very closely as a solutions developer and project manager and systems commissioner for the Resilience Project at VIA Mobility Services. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Lex.
Good day, everyone. So I'd like to start out by thanking all the partners involved in this project. Boulder Housing Partners, VIA Mobility Services, Independent Power Systems, POSN, Seth and the Clean Energy Group, and last but not least, the Department of Energy for making this all possible. So I'm going to start out by speaking about energy resilience in Boulder, Colorado, and sort of what is energy resilience. And I got a couple, 3 different definitions up here on the screen of kind of different energy resilience prongs that we might dive into and look at and think about in our work around resilience. The first is kind of just defining energy resilience as the capacity and active ability to maintain the provision of an adequate energy supply to meet critical load demands, usually focused on periods of disruption of the conventional energy delivery system. Renewable energy resilience is resilience specifically focused around the provision of this service with renewable resources or non-fossil fuel resources. And then another third definition is kind of true resilience, and that looks at if all these services of delivering energy were unavailable today, would you be able to supply the same resilience? So all those were kind of borne in mind throughout this project on both the implementation phases at Boulder Housing Partners and VIA Mobility Services, and kept at the forefront of kind of our mind in going through this. So next, we looked at a few of the objectives and goals from the city's perspective of these projects. And first and foremost, the city's got some kind of overarching goals in terms of emissions reductions and renewable energy generation. So we have a goal to reach 100% renewable energy generation by 2030, which is a relatively aggressive goal for the city. And we've also got another goal of 100 megawatts of local generation, renewable generation in the city by 2030 as well. So this kind of all ties into that. And, you know, the objectives and goals we had for this project were really to foster community resilience. And the primary method we had of doing that was ensuring the availability of some core community services that were very important to the city and community. To provide resilience in the face of electric system disruptions and natural disasters, the City of Boulder experienced a huge flood event back in 2013, and it really started the community and the city thinking about how can we make things better, how can we make our system and our community more resilient to not only natural disasters, but system disruptions and other events as well. Another goal that was a primary focus of this project was to enable resilient, renewable, and electric transportation options at VIA, and to really look at driving into a zero emissions fleet and leveraging solar and storage to get there. The final kind of piece was that to ensure Boulder Housing Partners and Via Mobility Services would remain online and operational during grid events. So Boulder Housing Partners acts as a command post for over 3,000 lower income community residents, and Via Mobility Services plays a critical role as a second responder in emergency events. So this project kind of started around looking at operational resilience for a critical water treatment facility in the city of Boulder, and looking at how we might be able to make this facility more efficient and resilient in the event of a disaster, as this facility was taken down during the 2013 flood, and it was a pretty severe event, and it really made the city realize that these critical facilities must remain online, and the resilience of these facilities is paramount to community service provision. So as that project kind of moved forward, we found that the cost of battery storage was prohibitive in terms of the city's allocated budget for resilience at the time to move forward with the upgrades at the water treatment plant. So the city worked on finding a few different sites to look at where we could implement resilient systems. And the slide you'll see up right now kind of lists Via Mobility Services and Boulder Housing Partners as two of the sites. And then we also worked with the University of Colorado on a couple different research fronts, where the university really looked at how it can meet its goals and how the university can install solar and storage and look at kind of generating a microgrid from a new East Campus development that they're building out and tying that into some of their existing main campus facilities, and then bolstering it with solar and storage, and assuring that research loads at the university could remain powered in the event of either power quality issues, disruptions, or other grid events. So really all three of these partners that the city worked with looked at how they could be integrating storage and solar, and in some of the instances, how they can back that up essentially with a generator. So at Boulder Housing Partners, we saw the installation of solar, a generator, battery storage, and they all work in concert to provide resilience to the Boulder Housing Partners headquarters. And a similar deployment at Via Mobility Center, but with a stronger focus on the electrification of transportation in the future, and how that's going to work for charging electric buses in a resilient fashion when the grid may or may not be available. So that was kind of a primary focus of this. So I'm going to hand it off here to Tim Beal from Boulder Housing Partners, and he'll go ahead and walk through some specifics of that project.
Yeah, hi everyone. Tim Beal from Boulder Housing Partners here. Just a quick introduction of who we are. We're the housing authority for the City of Boulder. As you can see, we provide 1,400 dwelling units of affordable housing spread throughout the City of Boulder, and those are located on 35 different communities in the city. In Boulder, we have a pretty significant housing crunch. The average income now for a family of four is over $100,000, and you can see, I'll show you on the next slide, the average income of the folks that we serve is significantly less than that. Rents can be, for instance, for a two-bedroom unit can be over $2,500, and our rents end up being probably a third of that. And we're challenged with another issue of a lot of in-commuting, so we're trying to figure out how we can provide more housing for another sustainability issue of how do we cut down on emissions and in commuting. We have a lot of sustainability objectives within Boulder Housing Partners, and we're currently on a goal to create a net zero portfolio. And those goals are really in parallel with the city and county of Boulder. We work very closely with both organizations to try to get to our goals and really serve our communities and really provide opportunities for lower income folks. As been mentioned, resiliency is becoming a really big part of these efforts. And we, as Lex mentioned, we experienced a pretty severe flood in 2013, which I think was a wake-up call for all of us. How can we, especially at Boulder Housing Partners, make our operation more sustainable in times of crisis? How can we then build that sustainability and resiliency within our communities? So this is the first great step of, we now have backup power on our main facility, which can help support our responses to our communities throughout the city. We found ourselves during the flood in many instances being a first responder because there's so much pressure is put on so many of the services during a disaster like this. We really have to be prepared as best possible to help support operations and really help our residents. Along with that, we're really trying to build within our communities more resiliency, just strengthening communities so that folks can really support each other in potential times of crisis. We've got some, highly skilled people, and we've got a very vulnerable population. So how do we support those folks again and have build resiliency within the community so that they can also support each other? Some of the other outcomes from this project, the solar that we installed on our office building was installed by Grid Solar, which people may be familiar with. It's a national nonprofit that helps with affordable housing. We also made that a community event, and residents and staff helped actually install the solar. So there was really, added community benefits in the preparation and work on this project. And envisioning the future, we're hoping that we can build, we're calling resiliency hubs in some of our community centers across our properties, which then can support, if we do another battery backup project or project, can support that local housing community as well as the surrounding neighborhood and be an added benefit to the overall community. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to Tony, who can go into more of the details on our project.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Hi, this is Tony Boniface. I'm the founder of Independent Power Systems back in 1996. When solar was relegated to off-grid, there was no grid-tie solar back then of any real capacity. So my DNA, our DNA at IPS is these off-grid systems, now referred to as microgrid systems. So I have a deep history of putting together all sorts of systems for providing power where there is no power. And the fundamental aspect of a resilient system is just that, is operating completely independently and robustly, I'll add. And with our long heritage of doing this, I've learned what really does work and what doesn't work. And as much as a lot of newfangled products out there, one of the big considerations in my design approach was sticking to the theme of resiliency, not flash and fanciness. And I took a real hard approach in that regard, which I'll describe here in a little bit. From those early days, of course, we morphed into doing residential rooftop grid-tie solar, and now we do quite a bit of commercial grid-tie solar as well. And what's interesting is the industry has evolved. Those of us who got started with battery systems, our knowledge is now coming back around to being very valuable as the grid seeks resiliency, not only for backup, but grid operators are also looking at it for making their grid more robust and resilient. So I'll switch slides. So I was approached by the City of Boulder initially, and then BHP directly work on the design of the project. And as I mentioned, I took very seriously the notion of resiliency, not just some backup power for the computers for a little bit, but really considering a long-term outage. As Tim mentioned, here in Boulder, we suffered the 2013 flood, and most everyone was unprepared for such a thing. It was actually considered a 500-year flood, and it's just amazing what happens when your infrastructure fails at every level. And getting prepared for such a thing is not easy to do, and most people don't want to consider these things. But when the power's out, you want to make sure your system is going to be there for you. So in that, I'll just mention some of the design considerations that informed me as to the ultimate solution. So the main thing was consistent power for critical loads and for long-term power outage. The idea wasn't necessarily we want to be backed up for a few hours or even a day, but what happens if we're really shut down for days, weeks, potentially. As Tim mentioned, there was a solar system going in on BHP here in North Boulder, roughly a 22 kilowatt PV system by another solar contractor. So I had to take that in consideration. And we would have encouraged putting one in regardless, because for any kind of long-term resiliency, solar's, you can't beat solar. The sun always does shine eventually. You can't say that you're always going to have fuel for your generators. So PV is really instrumental in any kind of long-term strategy for resiliency. Another key aspect was that the system worked seamlessly without a lot of fuss or special knowledge on site. When disasters strike, there's usually not necessarily a ton of warning, and you want to make these things easy to operate and work the first time. In consideration of resiliency, you want to be opportunistic. So one of the key elements was the fact that we did have natural gas on site. We discussed considering propane, which is another degree of resiliency beyond natural gas, because of course, if things get real bad, you can lose your natural gas supply, and a propane tank, of course, you're not going to lose. So we decided with natural gas, because that was what was available, and it was agreed upon that it's a pretty robust source here in Boulder. So I did incorporate a natural gas generator. And as I mentioned, been doing this for quite a long time. There's new products coming out all the time, especially as time of use metering and solar becomes a big thing, and lithium ion's gotten very popular. But I wanted to take an approach again that was based on products that I knew would perform without any question, because I've actually used these products for, in some cases, decades. The whole system was, there was a fair amount of effort in creating a critical load panel, because of course BHP wasn't wired that way at the outset. So there was quite a bit of coordination in getting what circuits into a critical load panel, and the system that I designed switched power over to that critical load panel in times of outage. Another key aspect of this design was that the power wasn't necessarily only going to be used for BHP's operations, but also to act as a command center for fire and police. So we made sure that circuits got moved from a corner of the building that could serve as a command post. Okay, so this is a photograph of the system. Looks quite complicated, but just give you a quick sketch out of it. On top, the gray boxes with the black bottoms, those are the PV grid tie inverters made by SMA. Below those are the 3 yellow SMA Sunny Island off-grid inverters. So Grid Alternatives installed the 3 up top, and we installed the rest of the system, the inverters, the batteries, the DC generator, the transfer switch, and tied everything together. The one of the challenges is that the system, the buildings provided three-phase power, 120 and 208 volts. There's not a lot of options out there for inverters, so it limited the pool of choice. I ended up with Sunny Islands, and they can configure that way, and also their design is based on an AC coupling off-grid mode, which is what we're using when we go off-grid, which I'll describe a little bit. So I encourage the grid alternative folks to use SMA inverters so that we had a full SMA solution that was designed to work together. What was interesting is there wasn't a lot of guidance on how much power was needed. So it was sort of, my proposal was, well, here's what the system can do. Let's create critical loads around that limitation versus a well-defined critical load at the time. As it turns out, the limitations of this system are 18 kilowatts continuous power, and the system can surge up to almost twice that, but easily to 25 kilowatts. The amount of battery storage was also in discussion, and oftentimes these projects, of course, are limited by budget. You always got to get the power right. The storage is the buffer that works to provide power when the sun's not shining and acts as a buffer between the solar array, the generator, and the load itself. So the fact that we had a generator in the mix allowed us to be not so conservative with the battery design and go with a 45 kilowatt hour battery bank. And the generator, I chose a DC generator as opposed to an AC generator for a number of reasons. Most importantly, hyper efficiency and low complexity, super simple machines. And again, with resiliency being key, generators can be one of the more problematic components of an off-grid system, being that they're quite complicated. And so anyway, chose a DC generator to minimize all that. So let's see, I'll move on. So, I think it's important to discuss the challenges in these types of projects for all of you considering these. Really the project went very smoothly, in large part to the fact that we're dealing with great folks at Boulder and at BHP. As I mentioned, we got into the project after the fact that another solar contractor was putting in a solar system. So I'd say the challenge was really integrating our system with theirs and making sure that this was going to turn out the way we wanted it to, given that they had their own ideas about things, but that went very smoothly. Lesson learned, kind of mentioned them, really cooperation is key in cities. Since we're talking about city resilient power, I really feel the city itself, the officials at every level have to be behind this to make these things go well. These systems are often very complicated, new technology, not very apparent to inspectors necessarily. And if they're going to come in with sort of a typical attitude of, well, I don't understand this stuff, you need to prove it to me 6 ways from Sunday, it can really slow things down and make the process slow. Fortunately, here in Boulder, we in particular have installed a number of systems like this for residences and so forth. So the inspector community is quite familiar with them, and that was all very important in the project moving through permitting in a timely manner and getting inspected. Let's see. So I think I'm good there. I'll pass the baton.
Hello, this is Bill Patterson. I'm the CFO at Via Mobility Services. I know Lex mentioned it earlier in the program here, but we're a 501c3 nonprofit transportation agency. We serve largely the elderly and people with disabilities, taking them all over the county. We do actually provide services in the 9 counties of Denver Metro and counties bordering Denver Metro. So it's a widespread operation. Lex also mentioned earlier that VIA is a second responder in times of crisis, and we've already talked about the flooding that Boulder had 5 years ago. There have also been some horrible wildfires here. So we're here to help evacuate people if need be, especially people with special needs, and take them to places where they can be cared for, perhaps outside the area that's affected. So it's important for us to be operational really at all times. And in order for us to be operational, we have to have electricity. We have to be able to run our computer systems. We have to be able to run our telephones and our radios. We have to be able to communicate with our drivers who have technology on the vehicles. We have to even be able to pump fuel. So when the idea came to us to become a resiliency hub in the city, we were very interested in that. You'll see in this photo, if you're looking at the webinar, our building was built and opened in 2011. And one of our values is to be environmentally sustainable, utilize renewable energy, and really be an environmental steward in the community as much as possible, even as a transportation agency. So we started into this idea by actually looking to purchase the solar array that we had on our building. It was an investor-owned solar array of about 97 kilowatts that was on the building, and it's grid connected. We had the opportunity after 6 years to purchase that array from the investor, and we were helped by the City of Boulder in a CDBG grant that we were able to obtain. In the course of doing that transaction, the city's environment and sustainability manager talked to us about resilience and the fact that they were looking for some folks in the community to do some resiliency projects. Not really knowing what that meant at the time, we still thought, that's a great idea because we really need to be up and have this building operational. The city introduced us to a company called PAWSN, and PAWSN introduced to us the idea of microgrids. I was fascinated by this idea. I thought, wow, if we could generate our own electricity and be able to operate this building and everything we do off the grid, that would be fantastic. Over the course of several months, and this introduction happened not even quite 2 years ago. So over the course of several months, we went through several design iterations. I bet you 10. And just things changed. We had other ideas. Could we do this? Can we do that? Can we add additional resiliency? What about if this happens? We finally settled on a design, so we thought. And until we received some grants to purchase some electric transit buses. We do provide some transit for the City of Boulder as one of the things we do. And this is starting to change in America, where public transit agencies are beginning to bring electric vehicles into their fleets. One of the big issues with that, though, is how do you charge that vehicle? Getting the money to buy the vehicle is one thing, but once you have it, now what? If you're charging off the grid, we have found that demand charges, even if you charge at night, are very steep. And in many cases, electricity to run your bus fleet exceeds what you were paying before for diesel or natural gas power for your vehicles. So we again changed the design to say, listen, we'd like to not only be able to run this building off the grid, have our own microgrid, but also be able to charge vehicles in addition to the power that we are able to generate. So we went on through this project, which Ben Gregory of Pazin will explain. We've been operational now since June of this year, so it took about a year and a half. Probably at least half of that time was just coming up with the design, and the other 9 months or so was implementation. And we are able to operate this building off the grid. Next week, at the time of this, as we're speaking today, we're 1 week away from receiving our first electric transit bus. And this won't even be a new bus. This will be a bus that we were able to take one of our older diesel buses and actually have it repowered into an electric bus. So we're extremely excited about that. We have the charging infrastructure already. We can charge this either off the grid or through our resilient project running as off the grid, and continue to keep this building running at full strength. So with that introduction, I will turn this over to Ben Gregory.
Thank you, Bill, and big thanks to Seth and Samantha for putting all this together. Love what the Clean Energy Group is doing, bringing resilience and social equity into the lexicon of the clean energy transition. It's something that I've been really waiting for from the beginning of my career, and I'm happy to see that it's actually coming around. When you look at the typical discourse on energy transition, a lot of the conversations focused around merely dollars per kilowatt hour. And looking at critical city assets, we can kind of reframe the conversation around more meaningful metrics, including things like, city folks transported per kilowatt hour, or or the ability to operate in time of need. So it's definitely an evolving market, but I'm happy to be a part of it and glad that we got to do this fantastic project. A little bit about Pazin. We are an energy infrastructure development company, which is a mouthful. Essentially, we do a turnkey approach, so finance, design, build, own, operate, maintain for the very long term, clean and sustainable energy infrastructure, with three main areas of focus. One is campus-wide integration efforts. Another is EV fast charging and microgrids for that market. And then finally, we work with resilience and the role that microgrids play in the resilient clean energy transition. Obviously, this project fits very nicely into the two latter categories. More into this project, when you typically look at resilience, it can be a daunting task, just because it seems like more of an insurance investment that you won't end up using rather than something that is an economic decision. So what we did is try to balance that cost per kilowatt hour versus real value gained here on this project. So therefore, rather than putting just a diesel backup generator on this facility, we went with a prime power natural gas, propane, and renewable natural gas generator with an extended enclosure so that we can tie in the combined heat now, rather than running at around 36% efficiency, and that's measured on BTUs in versus BTUs out. By recapturing the heat off of the generator and actually pumping it through the building, we're able to achieve around 85% efficiency. So that really actually helps pay for the investment. And the fact that we can use this during normal operation is an asset that we can use versus just more of an insurance policy. So we are using this currently to run the facility as a prime power generator. What we're doing as a next step in this project is an economic optimization project. So that's going to include putting in a control system to determine when the best time to run the combined heat and power generator is versus the grid, based on the increased load that Bill mentioned earlier, which is the electric buses. That was a very interesting problem to work through. Essentially, as Bill mentioned, we went on for several months iterating on the design to come up with something that we're all comfortable with. And then if you look at adding new electric buses to that system, essentially every new electric bus that we add increases the size of the load of the building by 2 times. So it's normally resting at about 66 kilowatts. Every time we add a bus, it's anywhere between 50 and 80 kilowatts. So that's a really interesting design challenge, but one that I think we solved quite well. So as another portion of this project, or part of this project, what we did, as Tony was mentioning earlier, is looking at the real critical loads of the facility and what actually needs to be operating during an emergency event. You don't typically need all of the outlets that you have, or even all the lighting, not even all the HVAC to operate during a real critical event. So what is the most basic means of operation that a facility can have to maintain its critical function? So we decided collaboratively to isolate the call center, which is a server room. Luckily, unlike Boulder Housing Partners, this already had a dedicated panel, load panel. So what we did is incorporate a DC-coupled solar and battery microgrid. I like to call this more of a nanogrid because it's actually just on one load center rather than on the whole facility. What's interesting about DC coupling this solution from a solar perspective is, just like at Boulder Housing Partners, when the grid goes down, the system will continue to operate. Now that's very different from when you see normal solar systems. For example, if you look at the 800,000 folks that just lost power after Hurricane Michael, most, if not all, of the residential solar systems that are AC coupled cease to operate when the grid goes down, and that's just to protect the folks that are working on the utility lines to help repair them. So by isolating the system down to a critical load and DC coupling the solar with storage, we're actually able to keep up and running no matter what's going on with the grid. So this is kind of a third redundancy on their call center for VIA. We have the grid, obviously, we have the generator, then we have the solar and batteries if all else fails. So, but in the spirit of keeping the solutions not as an insurance policy, but more as something that we can build off of, and what we have a lot of expertise in at POSEM is expanding this system to accommodate more DC microgrid features. So one of those is going to be adding more solar. One of those is going to be adding more storage. Another feature is adding more loads onto this DC system, which is going to decrease the complexity of the system as well as increase its efficiency. And then finally, looking at the new EV charging infrastructure that needs to go in. By staying DC end to end, and by DC, by the way, I mean direct current versus alternating current, we're actually going to be able to avoid upgrading the feeder, which is the utility service at VIA. That's actually a very big detriment and delay we're finding in a lot of EV fast charging implementations, is putting a brand new large load onto the grid where it wasn't expected. So we're able to avoid doing that. As Bill mentioned earlier, something I really like about this project is not just buying brand new buses, but actually reusing old buses. If you look at the carbon impact of extending a bus that was already on the road versus buying a brand new bus, there's a huge impact on the reduction of junk, carbon, diesel emissions on associated with that technology. So we're actually taking out the diesel infrastructure and putting in an electric drivetrain on this bus, hopefully for a significant amount cheaper than it is to buy a new bus. Finally, one last point on where this project is going, because what we did is design around where this project is going, not where it currently sits. So, what we'll be doing is dedicating the natural gas generator to servicing the building from a heat perspective, and only use it for trickle charging, a stationary storage battery, which will actually run the electric charging for the buses. So we're going to be putting in, if you look at the bottom here, around a 1.5 megawatt hour battery, around 300 kilowatts of solar to charge that battery during the day. And then when the buses come up at night, pull up at night, we'll use all of that stored solar to charge the buses. And we'll only use the generator to trickle charge when the solar and storage cannot keep up. So that's a really exciting new template as a solution template to start to advocate for, is especially in fleet operations, is isolating the solar and the storage for EV charging. As you can see, the financial impact of going this route, 14 cents a mile, and that's an all-in cost, versus 75 cents a mile on a diesel. It becomes a no-brainer. So I believe that will conclude my presentation here. I think we can skip this last one because we're out of time.
Okay, thank you, everyone. There's a lot of great information in there. We're going to open it up to questions now, and they have been coming in steadily as you guys have been talking. So I apologize ahead of time. I don't think we're going to get to them all. I'm going to have to prioritize a bit here, but we'll jump in now and see how many we can get to. So to start things off, got a question for you, Lex, or actually anyone that might know this. It's a question about, how often and how long are power disruptions in Boulder? What's the frequency of outages and the duration that you often see when those outages do hit?
Absolutely. This is Lex again. So typically something that has been provided by the local utility, just looking at numbers, and I'm recalling this off the top of my head, is for the Boulder area, we'll typically see about 2.5 hours of outage a year. So it's not extensive, and usually it occurs around a series of smaller events and perhaps one slightly larger event. That's an average for the system, however, and different areas of the system are subject to different performance and may experience longer outages. During events like the flood, there were various outages that were longer and more widespread as things couldn't be addressed immediately. So I think
Great.
that gets to that question.
Yeah, definitely. And you bring up a good point that, when you're talking about resilient systems, there's designing them for your average outages that you'd expect throughout a year, which tend to be the shorter duration outages. And then there's for the big events, which is a very much different design scenario when you're looking at resiliency for a big, day or multiple day event than you are looking to just keep things up and running through brief, hour-long outages. Another question to you, Lex, is how do you quantify the value of resiliency, which is always a big struggle with these kinds of projects and hard to monetize. And if you did consider the value of resiliency, how was that information integrated into the design process, or was it?
So in regard to the value specifically of resilience, I think Ben was hitting on this a little bit in regard to trying to quantify resilience as something a little bit more than perhaps $1 per kilowatt hour or $1 saved on energy. And I think one of the critical components of this was that some of these core services throughout our community are extremely valuable. And they go beyond a monetary value if you're helping someone survive. So I think that is kind of a key cornerstone and component of this, is that these services are, paramount to having a safe and resilient community. And to me, you couldn't really put a dollar sign on that.
If I may just jump in, this is Ben Gregory. Just real quick, a note on that. While it is tough to monetize those efforts, through some work with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, I know that San Francisco specifically is starting to put a working group on monetizing and quantifying the value of resilience for certain communities, looking at things like historical trends with climate events, expected new trends with climate events, things of that nature. So that's a pretty exciting effort going on.
Thanks for that, Ben. That is interesting. I'd like to hear more about that myself. One more that I think is mainly directed towards Lex, and this is a good question. Just wondering how these projects and the work that you've been doing on resilience and solar and storage and the generators, is this being incorporated into your city and county energy assurance and emergency preparedness efforts? Is this then informing those, or are these already a part of the plans that you're looking at?
So as Tim touched base on as well, and Bill, both VIA and Boulder Housing Partners kind of provide some of these core services, acting as a command post for police and fire, and a second responder in the event of crisis. So currently, and I guess VIA touched also on how they serve some of the neighboring communities and neighboring counties as well. So all of those were looked at as the provision of these services in assuring they remain resilient during disasters and events. So they kind of all were tied together, and I think looking forward, the vision is to keep expanding that horizon and looking at ways to broaden the scope of the resilience and reach more parties.
Great. And I think this question probably goes best to Tony and Ben. Just asking, in the design process, was there a target hours of outage that these systems were designed for? And in that design process, was it assumed that there would be sufficient solar to recharge the batteries? And how did that play into the design considerations?
Yeah, this is Tony. I can talk to that a bit on our system there at BHP. There really wasn't a lot of guidance around that. However, there was the notion of, many days seemed to be the goal of providing power. And of course, you can't count on solar energy necessarily. So, back to resiliency, that's where a generator does play a vital role. For that very fact, you can't build a battery bank big enough to carry large loads. I mean, or perhaps you can, but you'll quickly exceed reasonable budgets. So, I would say that the notion was, many days, sort of as what was experienced during the flood. And the generator was considered in that equation very much so, as well as the potential energy of the sun. So, arguably, if you have natural gas continuing to flow, you've got power indefinitely. And
then from our side, thanks for that, Tony. On our grant requirements, they spelled out some helpful guidance. One metric was we needed to keep critical systems up and running for 24 hours, and we could not rely on there being solar. When we originally scoped this project, we were looking at doing only solar and storage, and that would work for about 90% of the time. That 10% kind of excluded us from doing a system-wide solar and storage deployment and worked us more towards a generator deployment.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to open this up to the group, whoever wants to answer. Important question, would these projects still have happened without grant funding? And for these projects or other ones that you're working with, is finding third parties to finance the system's necessary component of getting these projects actually done and paid for?
This is Bill. I could address this from our standpoint. I guess the short answer is no. We couldn't have done this without grant funding. But one of our goals, in addition to all the other goals we have, is how can this pay? How can resilience pay for itself? And I think one of the things that Ben alluded to earlier was that not only is this an insurance policy or a disaster plan, but it's also can be used in our everyday business and save us money. And if that proves out, this is a great pilot for others who, we can say, look, this can save you money, this can pay for itself and provide you resilience in the case of some crisis. So we feel that will happen, but we have more data yet to gather.
Yeah, and this is Tim, just jumping in on what Bill said. I agree. I mean, the grant was essential in creating this pilot project, but I think we've learned so much and really opened our eyes to opportunities for like storage and arbitrage on demand charges, I think like Ben was alluding to. So we've really started to look deeply at, wow, this really could save significant money on our operations. So, again, we're looking at the data and trying to figure out where this is appropriate, but there's certainly more and more folks out there able to finance these types of projects. And we're really looking at it similar to like an energy performance contract where we could invest in the infrastructure, and the savings we realize will help pay for that infrastructure. So I think there are really some exciting financial opportunities moving forward that could be done without grant funding.
And if I may just point out one final note on this. So speaking about these specific projects, if you look at them, the off-takers are both are registered nonprofits. So obviously grant funding is a key funding mechanism. However, just looking from a more market-oriented position, these projects absolutely can pay for themselves, and especially when you look at the deferred costs from EV fast charging, it's really to the point where it's a no-brainer. So there is a lot of funding out there already, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody who's interested in exploring some of those options.
Great. We're almost out of time here, but I would like to get into one more question. I know some folks might have to drop off, but for those of you that can stay on, I think, is an important part. It's talking about the utility, which is Excel Energy there, I believe. Have they been a participant in getting these projects done, a partner or a barrier? And have these systems actually been run through a full test, both connected to the grid and have they done off-grid as well?
Yeah, let's see,
I'd be happy to go first if you want me to, Tony.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben. I think your system is more complex in that regard. So go for it.
Sure. Yeah, so as it comes to interconnection and coordination with the utility, since we actually went with a grid isolated architecture versus a grid interactive architecture, then we only were required to do a standard building an electrical permit. So that was really interesting. We did pass full inspection from Xcel and the state agencies, but when it comes to a full test, yes, we've absolutely done a full off-grid test, run for about 650 hours now, completely off-grid, and there has been some instances where the grid went down when we were running building power on the grid, and the server continued to run off of solar and storage for the duration of the outage.
Yeah, this is Tony, Independent Power Systems. So our system ultimately was grid interactive, given that the solar array was feeding power into the building all the time that it could. And anytime there's excess power, it would flow out to Xcel's grid. So we essentially, it was the other contractor, but they had to go through a net metering agreement with Xcel. We, on the other hand, had the battery component, and at the time of the installation, Xcel really wasn't paying too much attention to these battery systems. Of course, we went through standard permitting with the city and whatnot. Things have changed with Xcel. They are now very involved with these battery systems because they recognize that, frankly, people can use them to game, as they put it, game their systems instead of going towards time of use. So in any case, now there is a thorough review with Xcel when battery systems are included. And yeah, there's limitations that they impose.
Great, thanks for both those perspectives. So the takeaway is to get your systems done before the utility realizes that they're out there, I think. Great, thank you all for joining us for the webinar today. Thank you to all the speakers and on all of you that have attended. I do apologize, there were a lot of questions we did not get to here. So I encourage you to, if you have contact information for our speakers, contact them directly, or you can contact us, the Clean Energy Group. My email's up there. We'll be happy to pass along your questions to those that you want to hear from. So with that, I'm going to close things off and hand things over to Sam for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Seth. So I just want to let everyone know about a webinar we have coming up in November. The topic is energy storage in the Clean Peak Standard. This is going to be a really interesting webinar. If you would like to attend, it's free to attend and open to the public. You just have to register, and you can do that at cisa.org/webinars. So that's it for us today. We will be sending you a recording of today's webinar via email, so look out for that, and we hope to see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.